Iron and blood on Saipan. The air on Saipan was thick with salt and sweat. The waves crashed relentlessly against the jagged shore, and the humid heat clung to my uniform like a second skin. I remember the smell. It wasn't the pleasant scent of the ocean, but something metallic, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like the prelude to a storm. The island was a patchwork of jungle, cliffs, and beaches, the perfect place for an ambush, and the worst place to find yourself caught in a fight to the death. We had landed just days earlier, a battalion of Marines, fresh from the hell of the Pacific, moving into the heart of enemy territory. The island of Saipan was one of the key points in the Pacific that had to fall if we were to have any chance of breaking Japan's iron grip on the region. We didn't know it yet, but this was going to be one of the bloodiest chapters in a war that already seemed endless. And it would take more than just Marines to win this one. We had our tanks. My name's Henry Blake. I was a tank commander with the 1st Marine Division. We were a tough bunch, hardened by battle, but even we weren't prepared for what awaited us here. The first time I saw them, I didn't understand what was happening. It was early morning, the kind of gray before the sun rises, where everything feels like it could go either way. We were advancing through a thick jungle patch, the underbrush crackling under our treads when the noise started. First, it was a distant rumble, the sound of voices chanting, rising in crescendo, until it hit me like a slap across the face. The Japanese were coming. I ordered my driver to push ahead, but we were slowed by the dense foliage. I looked to my right, where the infantry was fighting through the same thick brush, keeping low, crouching as if the very air itself might betray them. Then it happened. A shape appeared in the fog. It wasn't one man. It was hundreds. The enemy had done something we'd never fully understood until we saw it ourselves. They were coming straight at us, shouting and screaming like men possessed. It was their Banzai charge, an act of madness, a last-ditch attempt to drive us into the sea. I don't know how to describe the sound of it. It wasn't just the gunfire, or the screaming, or the roaring engines of our tanks. It was something primal. The ground shook beneath us, and for the first time in my life, I felt fear. It wasn't the kind of fear you get before a fight, or when you're about to go over the top. It was a cold, gut-wrenching fear, the kind you can't shake. The first wave of attackers charged us with such ferocity that we almost didn't see them coming until it was too late. A man, no older than 20, came running at us with a bayonet fixed to his rifle, a grin on his face, a maniacal gleam in his eye. He didn't care that we had tanks. He didn't care that we had guns. He didn't care about anything but death. The sheer madness of it, the desperation in their eyes, was enough to freeze you in your tracks. The battle became a blur after that. The infantry was pinned down, unable to break through the enemy's lines. Our tanks, built to crush and devastate, had become sitting ducks. The Japanese didn't retreat, didn't falter, didn't flinch. They fought like rabid dogs, charging at us with an unholy ferocity that made the air itself feel thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. I ordered my crew to open fire. The heavy artillery from the tank's main gun rattled the air, and explosions rocked the battlefield, sending debris flying in every direction. The ground beneath us turned to a slurry of mud and blood. The infantry ahead of us held their ground, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We were all just trying to survive. We pushed forward, as much to escape the madness behind us as to advance. But it wasn't enough. It never was. The Japanese kept coming, wave after wave, until the battlefield was a twisted, charred mess of bodies and broken equipment. I remember looking over at the men in my tank, their faces grim, their eyes wide. We were all in it together, but for the first time, we all realized how close we were to the edge of that darkness we tried so hard to ignore. By the end of that first day, we had lost more men than I could count. The tanks had taken hits too. Some of them, the ones closer to the shore, were in flames, their crews either dead or trapped. The island was turning into a graveyard, and I could hear the screams of the wounded in the distance, muffled by the constant barrage. But there was no turning back now. There was nothing left but to push forward, to keep fighting. That night, as we took refuge in the jungle, I sat alone in the command tank, trying to process what had just happened. The moon was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore were strangely soothing amidst the chaos. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? What I'd seen, what we'd been through, it was too much. We had all seen death before, but this was something else entirely. The next day, the tanks rolled out again. And as we moved forward, through the wreckage of the previous day's battle, the landscape seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the jungle, which once seemed like a place of refuge, now felt like a labyrinth of death. Every turn, every shadow, every movement felt like a threat. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. But we kept going. We didn't have a choice. We were Marines, and we had a job to do. The tanks rolled on, and as I looked to my left and right, I knew that this was only the beginning. What came next would be worse, I knew that for sure. The battle for Saipan was far from over, and I had no idea just how much more we would have to give before it was all said and done. The next few days blurred together in a haze of smoke, fire, and blood. We moved relentlessly, inching forward through the jungles and craggy hills of Saipan, pushing against the tide of enemy resistance that never seemed to stop. Each day felt like we were walking in the footsteps of ghosts, shadows of men who'd been here before us. The jungle, dense and suffocating, was alive with the sound of distant gunfire, the occasional explosion that rattled the ground, and the eerie silence of what we'd left behind. There were no moments of peace, no breaks in the madness. The enemy kept coming at us with the same feverish desperation, determined to make us pay for every inch of ground we took. They were everywhere, it seemed. Their tactics were maddening, unexpected, terrifying. Sometimes they came in waves, others in scattered, unpredictable pockets of fire. But there was one constant: the brutality. The Japanese soldiers didn't just want to kill us. They wanted to destroy us, to grind us down into nothing. It wasn't enough to defeat us. They sought to erase us from the island. And we were paying the price for it. My tank crew was thinning out. Men were wounded, some gravely, others lost in the chaos of battle, their bodies swallowed by the jungle or left in the twisted wreckage of their tanks. Those of us who remained pressed on, but the reality of it all was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a fight to win. It was a fight to survive. I remember one morning, the sun still hidden behind thick clouds, when we advanced into a small valley. The air was thick with tension, and even the birds in the trees seemed to be holding their breath. We were nearing the heart of the enemy position, but no one dared speak of it aloud. We had learned by then to keep our thoughts to ourselves. The battlefield had a way of stealing words before they could form. We moved cautiously through the valley, the tracks of our tanks sending vibrations through the ground, announcing our arrival to anyone who cared to listen. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the ground erupted in a hail of bullets. Machine guns, mortars, and rifle fire tore through the air, and we were in the thick of it before we could even react. The noise was deafening, so loud that it felt like the world itself had been turned upside down. The Japanese were on us again, this time not with a Banzai charge, but with a calculated, ruthless firestorm. The first explosion hit just behind us, throwing my tank off balance. I gritted my teeth as the shockwave rattled the metal frame, my body slamming against the turret as the crew scrambled to regain control. It didn't take long for the realization to set in. They had us in their sights. We weren't just up against soldiers. We were up against a well-coordinated, determined enemy that would stop at nothing to take us down. I could hear the radio crackling in my headset, the voices of other crews shouting for support. But it was chaos. Everyone was on their own, cut off from the rest of the battalion. The air was thick with smoke now, the jungle around us shrouded in a haze of gunpowder and fire. We couldn't see a damn thing. And then came the worst sound of all, the screeching of metal on metal. Another tank, one of our own, had been hit. We didn't know where the enemy was. We didn't know where the next hit would come from. All we had were our senses, our instincts, and the hope that we could hold on long enough to push through. I ordered the driver to reverse, hoping to break contact and find some cover. But the tank shuddered under the weight of another explosion, and we were thrown into disarray. One of the crew members screamed, clutching his leg. I didn't have time to check on him. We were still under fire. The next blast came just as I was about to give the order to fire. The tank lurched violently, and for a moment, I thought we were done. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. We fired back, not sure if we hit anything, just trying to keep the enemy at bay. The machine gun roared, and the turret spun with a deafening whine. It felt like we were firing into the void, into a cloud of smoke and confusion. But we kept pushing. We kept fighting. By the time we pulled back to regroup, the battlefield was a twisted mess. Tanks were burning, infantry scattered, and the ground was littered with the dead. It was hard to tell who was on which side anymore. The once beautiful landscape of Saipan was now nothing more than a graveyard, a place where men had come to die, to fight and to suffer. But as the smoke cleared, something else caught my eye. A small group of Japanese soldiers, moving in a line, had broken through the front lines and were advancing on our position. They were quiet, almost as if they had learned to move without making a sound, to slip between the cracks where our eyes couldn't follow. It was then I realized they were going for the tanks. My heart sank. We couldn't let them reach us. I called for reinforcements, but I knew they were too far out. It was up to us now. I looked around at the remaining men, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes wide with adrenaline. There was no time to hesitate. I slammed my fist against the turret, signaling the driver to move forward again. We had no choice but to meet them head-on. We moved with precision, the tank rolling forward like a predator, and as we neared the enemy, the first of the Japanese soldiers rose up from behind a rock. Rifle in hand, his eyes locked onto ours. Time seemed to slow as I raised my hand, giving the order. The cannon roared, and the soldier disappeared into a cloud of smoke and debris. But they didn't stop coming. It was the closest we had come to breaking, to being overrun. But somehow, against all odds, we held our ground. The Japanese soldiers, relentless as they were, never ceased their assault, but they couldn't overcome us. We were Marines, and that meant something even here, in the heart of this godforsaken island. As the last of the attackers fell, we took stock of our losses. 2 more tanks had been lost. A handful of men had been wounded or killed. And yet we were still standing. We had fought off an ambush, but I knew it wouldn't be the last. The enemy was still out there, waiting for the next chance to strike. And so we pressed on, deeper into the jungle, deeper into the heart of the battle. The sun beat down mercilessly, but the jungle, even with all its horrors, felt like the only place left where we could still breathe. The days had begun to lose their meaning. Time itself seemed to have dissolved into a haze of battle, smoke, and blood. The once vibrant jungles of Saipan now felt like a prison, an unending maze of death where each step forward was a fight for survival. We had moved so far into the heart of the island, it felt like there was no turning back. And perhaps there wasn't. There was only forward, always forward. Every morning felt the same. The air was thick with the promise of battle, the sound of the jungle unsettlingly quiet as we prepared for whatever new horror awaited us. Each day, we had to rebuild our resolve. After every battle, after every ambush, we took stock of our losses and pressed on, like the machines we rode, our bodies and souls twisted by the war. But it was getting harder to ignore the weight of it all, to deny that we were all changing, bit by bit, piece by piece. We were becoming more like the enemy we fought against, not in our methods, but in the sheer will to survive, to push past all that was human in us, all that made us care about anything. That final push came on the 3rd week of our campaign. We had reached the western shores of the island, the goal now clear: crush the remaining Japanese forces, wipe them out, and secure the island. But it wasn't going to be that simple. Nothing ever was. The air was heavy with tension as we pushed forward in a column of tanks, the weight of the mission pressing down on our chests like an iron vice. The enemy had been retreating, regrouping, pulling back into a final stronghold near the coast. We knew it would be a tough fight. They had dug in deep, creating a network of bunkers, trenches, and foxholes that stretched for miles. We were walking into their last stand, and they would not give up without a fight. As we moved into position, the ground rumbled beneath us, the roar of distant artillery, the pounding of enemy mortars. I could see the smoke rising in the distance, feel the vibration in my bones as the earth shook with the violence of the battle. It wasn't just artillery now. The Japanese were launching their last desperate attacks, trying to break our advance before we could reach them. We were about to charge straight into the heart of hell. I gave the order to roll out. The tanks moved forward, tracks grinding over the uneven ground, the low hum of the engines filling the air. The jungle was thick here, dense with trees and vines, but ahead of us was a clearing. It was almost too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I looked through the periscope, eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any movement, any sign of life or death. Then, like a crack of thunder, the world exploded. The first explosion rocked our tank, throwing us off balance. The force of the blast sent a wave of heat through the hull. I heard the screams of my crew as the shockwave rattled the metal, and for a moment, all I could do was hang on. The engine sputtered, and I thought we were done for. but somehow we managed to regain control. I slammed my fist against the radio, shouting for the crew to return fire. We couldn't afford to let the enemy know we were crippled. The battle turned into a chaotic blur. Gunfire was everywhere, the sound of machine guns and rifles mixing with the deafening roar of artillery. The enemy had set traps, hidden mines, anti-tank weapons, and sniper positions in the trees. It felt like they were everywhere and nowhere. And for the first time since I'd been on Saipan, I felt fear in my bones, but I couldn't show it. I couldn't let my men see that I was afraid. We had been through too much together. I had to lead them, even if it meant marching us all straight into the fire. Through the smoke and the debris, I saw the first wave of infantry moving forward. They were charging across the open ground, running low, trying to reach the cover of the jungle. The ground beneath us shook as more explosions hit. I couldn't tell if it was the enemy or our own artillery. It didn't matter. The tank was a moving fortress, but it wasn't invincible. I could feel the sweat pooling in my palms as I gripped the controls, my mind racing. If we didn't make it through this, if we didn't break through their lines, it would all be for nothing. Then, just as we approached the enemy's final defensive line, the worst possible thing happened. A massive artillery shell hit a tank in front of us, tearing it to pieces. The blast sent debris flying, and I saw the crew, or what was left of them, scattered in the aftermath. The tank was destroyed, burning, black smoke rising into the sky. My stomach turned, and my breath caught in my chest. We couldn't stop now. We had to keep pushing. We had no choice. I barked orders into the radio, telling the other tanks to spread out, to hit the enemy from different angles. But the terrain was against us, the jungle was thick, and the ground was uneven, making it difficult to maneuver. The enemy knew the land better than we did. They were using the terrain to their advantage, hiding in the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake. We pushed forward, cautiously, step by step, inch by inch. The sound of our engines was deafening, but it was drowned out by the constant barrage of enemy fire. The tank rocked with every explosion, the ground shaking with the force of the bombardment. I could feel the tension building, the weight of it pressing down on me like a vice. And then, without warning, a figure appeared through the smoke. A Japanese soldier, running full speed towards our position, a grenade in each hand. I don't know what possessed him. Maybe he was trying to take us down with him, or maybe he was just trying to make a final stand. But there was no time to think about it. I pulled the trigger without thinking, and the soldier fell, his body crumpling to the ground. But he wasn't the last. They kept coming, wave after wave of enemy soldiers, charging toward us with nothing but their rifles and their determination. The battle raged on, but we were wearing them down. Slowly but surely, we began to break through their defenses. The tanks moved in, crushing their positions, pushing them back inch by inch. But with every victory, the cost was higher. The enemy wasn't surrendering. They were dying one by one, but still, they fought until there was nothing left but their blood, their bodies, and the sounds of their screams echoing in the smoke. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the fighting began to subside. The tanks rolled through the remains of the enemy positions, their guns silent for the first time in days. We had broken their final line. Saipan was ours. But even as the smoke cleared and the sounds of battle faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost, something I couldn't quite grasp. We had won, yes, but at what cost? The island was covered in the blood of men, both ours and theirs. I looked out over the battlefield, the corpses of soldiers scattered like broken dolls, the charred remains of tanks and weapons littering the ground. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until now. War doesn't have winners. It has survivors. I was a survivor. But at what price? As the sun set over the bloodied land of Saipan, I could only hope that we had done enough, that the sacrifice we had made would mean something in the end. But for now, there was no peace. Only the quiet hum of the tanks, the slow, steady march of men, and the ever-present weight of the war that still loomed ahead. Iron and blood. That's all we had left.